Ladies and gentlemen, friends, at this time we are going to begin the memorial services for Stephen M. Rayman. If you have a cell phone or a pager, I would ask for you to please take a moment. Thank you for so many of you already starting to take a look. Please take a moment to make sure that your noise-making device is off or at least placed in the silent mode. And for those of you who aren't able to be here in person but are joining us via the live stream, your presence is also known and felt and acknowledged by the family. Thank you. Officiating today's services will be Rabbi Michael Tillman, and as we begin the service, the rabbi will lead the family in the tradition of Kriya.
As Mr. Seaver mentioned, the tradition of Kriya began a long time ago in the biblical period of our history. In the text of the Tanakh of the Hebrew Bible, we find that whenever people receive sad news, including those of a passing of a loved one, they would tear their clothes and put a dust upon the head as a sign of mourning. And the custom of rending our garment when the close relative passes away, departs from this world, we retained in our community to this day. Therefore, at this time, I will tear the ribbons given to the brother, the widow, and the children of the deceased. Remain seated, please. Have you? Have you? No. You are the only one. Goldie, you're always ahead of us. All the time. Every time. Every time. Yeah, tell me about it. Blessed is the Lord our God, ruler of the universe, judge. Amen. A very long time ago, more than 25 years ago, more than a quarter of a century ago, when I was still a young man studying at the Rabbinical Academy, I had a teacher. He was a professor of history. His name was Jacob Rader Marcus. The man lived to be almost 100 years old. He fell a couple of weeks short of that remarkable birthday of his. And I was the last class that he taught. He was 98 and a half at the time, but very sharp mind. And he was brilliant. In fact, Dr. Marcus wrote the very first book on the history of the American Jews. So he single-handedly founded the entire field of the historical studies. And during one of our sessions in class, we started talking about funerals. And Dr. Marcus told us, well, he told me actually personally, because he was answering my question. He told us something that astounded me at the time. I was just almost shocked to hear what he said. He told me, he was from West Virginia, hence he had this peculiar accent. He said, Michael, y'all better believe it. 5 minutes got to be enough to say everything important about anybody. Like many young people, I perceived death rather dramatically, so I couldn't believe, what do you mean, 5 minutes about every person? Eulogy for 5 minutes? But when I started practicing as a rabbi, I realized that he knew what he was talking about. I realized what he really meant. So 5 years after that particular conversation, I was here in Skokie, sitting in the house of the family. They lost their father, 2 children, 2 sons. And I quoted my teacher. And one of the sons told me, but Rabbi, this is very sad. I said, what's so sad? He said, the entire life in 5 minutes. And came out by itself. I didn't even think about it, just automatically. I answered automatically. I said, well, what good is a book if you can't tell me in 5 minutes what the book is about after you read it? Life is a book. Like any book, it has the beginning. Like any book, it has the ending. And when we gather together to honor people whom we love, but whom we sadly lost, it's not only about the pain of loss. And absolutely, today we are with you, my dear friends, with you, Goldie, Stacey, Josh, Bruce, Mark. Of course, we're here to support you, to support each other, because Steve was so dear to us. So it is about the pain of loss, but it's not only about that. It is also about the book that Steve is leaving for us as his legacy. His book of life, the one that he has written. It is not by chance, by the way, that I decided to offer you an insight about the books, because as you all know, or most of you do know, Steve was a reader too. He loved to read. He read. And may I add that sadly, we live in the country where 60% of the Americans never finish a book in their lives, which is terrible. It's pitiful. Steve set an example. Read. Well, sci-fi books too. Right? So today is also about Steve's book. And the book that he is living for us is not the reason for sadness. It is the reason for joy and pride. So today, along with sorrow, we also feel joy. Along with tears that we shed, we also know that with the passage of time, the pain of loss will subside, the tears of sorrow will dry out, but what will remain is the joy of remembrance and Steve's book of life as an inspiration for us. That's why when we grieve, we're like children. We cry, and we laugh at the same time. That is just how this world is and how it ought to be, part of the experience of living. How do we write that book? Because everyone writes their own. 3,000 years ago, King Solomon wrote a book, or at least our tradition suggests that he did, called Ecclesiastes in English, Kohelet in Hebrew. A very unusual book. Many rabbis even questioned the validity of its inclusion into the biblical collection. But all the same, it became canonical. This book is unusual because it's not about God. It's really not about God and a human being. It's really about what it is like to live. If you will, the first example of an existentialist literature in the human history. So chapter 3, that's where we find a beautiful and a very famous reflection on the meaning of life and on the fact that when we live, we encounter everything, good and bad, painful and joyous, painful and pleasant, sad and joyous. And it is our duty to make sure that every experience counts, that it's meaningful. And that's how we write the book of life. The words of King Solomon. לכל זמן ועת לכל חפץ תחת השמיים, עת ללדת ועת למות, עת לטעת ועת לקור נטוע, עת לפרוץ ועת לבנוד, עת לבכות ועת לשחוק, עת צפות ועת רקוד, עת להשליך אבנים ועת כנוס אבנים, עת לחבוק ועת לרחוק מחבק, עת לבקש ועת לאבד, עת לשמור ועת להשליך, עת לקרוא ועת לתפור, עת לחשות ועת לדבר. For everything there is a season and a time for every experience under the heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to discard. A time to rend and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. It is a time to speak. It is a time to reflect on Steve's book of life. So here are my 5 minutes. Well, most likely it will be 5 Jewish minutes, which means that each minute lasts longer than 60 seconds. Oh well. Oh well. Steve ran in this world here in Chicago, 1943, and all of his life pretty much is associated with the Chicagoland. Went to Bowling High, then he ended up working for his father's company. Joseph Rayman Company was called, correct? Yes, Joseph Rayman Company. So his dad started that business. Steve continued it, and I think after Joe's passing, he kept running it. They were manufacturing reps, and he became a rep pretty much for the rest of his life, because when the company was closed, he worked for MetLife pretty much for the rest of his career, selling all kinds of products, well, insurance, annuities, things of that nature. He was a rep. Now, this is why I want to talk about this a little bit. This is the kind of business where absolutely everything, your success, your productivity is based on how people perceive your integrity, your honesty, and your own belief in the product that you're selling. It is critical, and you have to be genuine. You can't be fake. You have to be honest. You have to be genuine, because people will feel it. Because the things that you sell are not just some kind of a durable goods. They're also important. I'm not diminishing it. You don't even selling cars. You're selling things that have everything to do with people's lives, literally. And to be good at this, you really have to possess all those important character traits. You have to be honest, you have to have integrity, you have to believe in what you do, and you have to genuinely be interested in helping people to, well, get set up in life, in particular with these financial aspects of their lives. And that's all that Steve did. He was naturally that way. Now, he didn't work forever, thank God. None of us should. So eventually he retired. And I'm quoting Goldie here. He enjoyed his retirement. He enjoyed it a lot. And the reason why is because, Steve was the kind of guy that had so many interests in life. He really loved to live. He loved to live in many, many ways. When we were talking yesterday, I asked him, what did he like to do? Then came the list, and I'm looking at this list, I'm trying to figure out what did he not like to do, right? Everything was interesting. Photography, here we are. Reading, there we go. And sci-fi. Thank you, Stacey, for that last night's call. That was an omission that would have been unforgivable if we skipped it. Sci-fi. He was huge into sci-fi. Sci-fi books as well as sci-fi movies. I must admit, when I moved to the United States 30 years ago, 1992, my friend kind of set me down to watch my very first Star Trek episode. Remember, it was 1992, and when did Star Trek start? I had no idea what's going on in there. Not a clue. Steve was a huge Star Trek fan. But to be a Star Trek fan, as you all know, you must be like inside of that thing. You must be in. So you have to like know when it started, what was happening. Otherwise, you're not going to get it. I never got it, unfortunately. But he was into Star Trek big time. He loved it. He loved it. Not that Goldie shared that. That wasn't one of the things that they shared together. But they shared many other beautiful things. They traveled, had a great time together. Steve loved sports. He loved golfing. He enjoyed bowling tremendously. In fact, for many years, he bowled the B'nai B'rith League. Well, B'nai B'rith was famous back in the day for having the bowling league. I mean, I know a lot of Jewish folks who bowled there. It was very, very popular in our community for a time. Now, being a sports fan for Steve was, just like for me and Mark. It was big. It was big. He was a huge fan of the Chicago Bears, and I appreciate that Bears mask there. Is that Bears mask? Yeah, it is Bears mask. Yeah. Now, Goldie shared with me that when they were getting married, right, the date of the wedding, well, it was February. They got married in February. The date of the wedding had to be after the Super Bowl. It could not be until the football is over. You just don't do it like that, right? So that was important. Well, there we go. So you know how important it is. And I must comment, our beloved Bears is one of the unluckiest major football franchises. No, seriously, I mean, in the 80s, they should have won 5 or 6 instead of just 1. That's what I'm saying. It's like the best team that couldn't quite... Okay, at least they did it in 85. The Cubs. What can you say about us, the fans of the Chicago Cubs? Only to quote King Solomon, I used to make that quote, so paraphrasing a line from the book of Ecclesiastes. One generation cometh, another generation passeth away, and the Cubs still lose. Come November 2nd, 2016, we lose no more. Steve lived to see the Cubs winning the World Series. And you all know what it really means, because the previous time was 1908. I've known people who were the Cubs fan, lived into their 90s and never saw their team win. This is how great of a blessing that day was, November 2nd, 2016. Steve was a happy man. Steve was a Jewish boy, and like all Jewish boys, he loved food. He loved food. He loved to eat. Right. But food that he liked wasn't exactly healthy. So on the list of his hobby, I have junk food, not just any food, junk food. He loved movies too. I would mention his passion for sci-fi films, but also at some point he got into westerns too. John Wayne and all these American classics. Well, of course, those things are great. Those things are wonderful. Now, the most important thing in Steve's life was his family. He worked hard, yes. He loved life, he did. But there was nothing more important than people that were dearest to him. He was a loving husband of Goldie. I'm quoting her, best friend. Best friend. A wonderful husband. Life is not a smooth ride. Life is more like flying across the ocean on the airplane. On another long flight, you're going to have smooth ride, and then you're going to hit turbulence, then it's going to smoothen out again. And that's how life is. That's how family life always works. And they've been together through great things. Stacey's wedding in particular, that was a great thing. They've been together through challenges too. In recent years, they bore their challenges. They supported one another. They took care of one another. Steve was a source of support to Goldie. But all that matters is that they went through these life experiences together as one. That's what makes a good couple. That's what makes a successful couple. He was a loving husband of Goldie. God blessed him with wonderful children. And I'm saying that not as a matter of formality, because I have a pleasure of knowing Stacey and Mark, his son-in-law, and Josh, to a lesser extent, but also. You know, every father, every parent really, has an obligation to raise good children. Now, what does it mean, though? When our children grow up and they find success in life, the career goes well, for example, we're proud, rightfully so, but that's not what it does it. What does it? What does it is that the moment arrives and I say to myself, my daughter, my son, grew up to be a good human being. That's when I accomplished my mission. And Steve was proud of his children, and quite rightly so. Steve has a brother, Bruce, who's with us today, joined us. Thank you, Bruce, for honoring your brother's memory. And this was the man who is leaving behind a book so rich, so beautiful. And again, there's nothing fancy about it, but simple things are always the most beautiful. Let us continue honoring Steve's life, reflecting on his book of life through thoughts and reminiscences of his loved ones. So first up will be Stacey, who will share with you her thoughts, and Mark will come as the source of strength and support for his wife.
I'm going to try to make this lighthearted in the way my dad would want this to be, funny and full of laughter. If I don't, I won't get through it and I'll be crying my eyes out. My dad was a wonderful person. My mom was the love of his life. He also loved Josh, Mark, and myself with all of his heart. Although I do think that junk food was loved just as much as all of us. I cannot tell you how many emails, calls, and texts that I received from him asking me to buy him Hostess Ho-Hos, Twinkies, cupcakes, Little Debbie Nutty Bars. I think you get the picture. My dad had a major junk food addiction. He would search the internet for new junk or recipes that sounded good to him, and then he would email or text me them, adding a note that, "These sound good, please buy them for me." Dad was the biggest Bears fan ever. He had the schedule in his phone, in his book, on the table next to his chair, and he had Mom put all the games on her calendar as well. He could not and would not miss a game, even when they were getting blown out. Watching the Cubs win the World Series in 2016 was a dream come true to my dad. He cried like a baby. I know they were tears of happiness. He loved going to Sloan Park in Arizona to see spring training games. He was so happy when Mark and I started dating because Mark is a Cubs fan also. I still don't know how my brother became such a big White Sox fan, but Dad still loved him just as much as the rest of us. Dad was a wonderful man. He was caring, loyal, funny, loving, and an all-around great person who always had a smile on his face. To end, after my dad had a stroke 2 years ago, he got in the habit of calling me in the morning exactly at 9 a.m. to say good morning and at 10 o'clock to say good night. I personally think he would set the timer on his phone because he was always right on time. Every day since he's passed, I look at the clock at those times, thinking my phone is going to ring, and they don't. This was our good night call every night. I would say hello.
Hello. I'll talk to you in the morning. Say goodnight to Mark for me.
I'd say okay, and then he'd hang up. We love you, Dad, and we'll always miss you.
Steve was a wonderful friend. You got friends who, well, he was friends for a long time, basically a lifetime. And one of his good friends, Jerry Schechter, will now share his thoughts with about Steve. Yeah. Oh, here we are. Okay.
Well, it was 35 years ago that I met Steve. A friend of mine asked me to join a Sunday morning bowling league. I was put onto an existing team that needed one bowler. The guys on the team were Erwin Roll, Al Rosenston, and Steve. They were very welcoming. Steve and the guys became lifelong friends. Steve and I would become best friends. We would do many things together, from going to many a Star Trek convention to many movies that our wives did not want to go to. One of our usual outings was going for lunch and then Barnes & Noble. Steve loved getting the TV Guide and other magazines. He also would walk out with books galore. In the past few years, it was harder to get together. COVID made everything harder. We did talk on the phone about the Bears. We would watch the games and then call each other to complain about the team. Fortunately, we were able to have lunch after a while and maintain this wonderful friendship. And there's a quote by Dr. Leonard McCoy, if anyone knows who he is, in The Wrath of Khan. As long as we remember him, he will live on.
Finally, last but certainly not least, Steve's son, Joshua, will share his thoughts about his beloved father.
So I'm not as eloquent as my sister, so I don't really have a speech. I just wrote down like a whole bunch of memories and things. So I know, I remember my dad going when, like in the late 80s, to Bears games with friends. Like they took a limo and played poker and stuff. And I remember that was kind of how I started, like, my love of the Bears. I remember I think it was September 15th of 91. That's when he took me in my first Bears game against the Giants, which they won. I remember that, one thing I remember is that, is the rabbi said about my mom and dad getting married after the Super Bowl. Every year on my birthday, my dad would always call me like after like 3:15 or so, because he always told me he knew I was gonna be a Bears fan because of the fact I had to wait to be born till after the Bears game ended. As my friends know, I love meeting celebrities and sports players. I remember my dad taking me to meet like Bears players when I was younger, like Dan Hampton. As the rabbi mentioned, he was a huge movie fan. I remember every Christmas we went to see a movie, and you would think taking kids to a movie on Christmas, he would take us to a family movie. That wasn't my dad. My dad always took us to like the big, like motion pictures, big epic movies. I remember seeing Forrest Gump. I remember seeing Private Ryan, And I remember the only movie my sister, I think, saw more than once in the theater, he actually took us to see Titanic, I remember. I also remember, I know I got my love of reading from my dad. I remember, my dad was a huge sports fan. I remember we had kind of like a game. Like, he would be laying in bed watching TV since he was a huge TV fan. And, I'd be kind of, in my doorway, and he would try and, throw a ball, past the door, and we would just, have a kind of a game. He also played, I remember him playing horse with me when we got our basketball hoop, and I remember a few times he played catch with me. I remember he took me a handful of times bowling. He was very, into bowling, and that, he always, tried to correct me on my bowling, but just, I was with my mom is and my dad is, I was stubborn, and I didn't take his advice. They always say, father like son. One thing my dad always did, he took after his father. My grandpa always sent newspaper clippings, and he would send my sister literally 10 emails a day of sports, Bears news and stuff, even though my sister, I told him earlier about it. I got my love of taking photos from my dad. I think the rabbi mentioned it, or my sister did. My dad, every single time my dad introduced me to one of his friends, every single time, it's always the same thing. This is my son Josh, but I think he's adopted because he's a White Sox fan. Every single time. Didn't fail. He loved traveling. I remember one time he was coming home from Arizona. Me and my friend Brian and we drove back from Arizona. As the rabbi and everybody mentioned, he was a huge Cubs fan. I remember that we would be in a hotel room, and he would be in one room watching the Cubs game, and Brian and I, who are huge Sox fans, would be in the other room making fun of the Cubs. And even though he was a huge Cubs fan, unlike me, who I do not support the Cubs, he actually always supported the White Sox for me, and he even supported them when they won the World Series. And the only other thing I really have is he had a good work ethic that I got from him. Even though there are days where I wish, I could call out of work to go to a Sox game and meet a celebrity. He instilled a really strong work ethic in me, so I don't think I've ever really missed a work day other than, for personal reasons. But I love my dad, and I'm going to miss him. So, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Josh. My dear friends, today is the day when we are honoring Steve. We know we're parting with him, but we also must remember this is merely a physical parting. In the most important sense of that word, in the spiritual sense of that word, the angel of death, Malach HaMavet as we call him, cannot take him away from us. Because what will remain here, what will remain with us, is the book of life written by Steve. It is our precious treasure, and we will honor his legacy by our own good deeds, by our own support for one another, by our own love for this world and for each other. May Steve's memory be a blessing upon all of us. Let us honor Steve's memory with a moment of silence. Please rise, and the memorial prayers will follow. Sit. Yeah, no, she can sit. Well, she's stubborn, yeah. אל מלא רחמים שוכם במרומים, אמצע מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים אותורים כזער הרקיע מסג'רים, את נשמת סטיב שהלך לעולמו, בעל הרחמים יסתרג בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, וצור בצור החיים מת נשמתו, אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר אמן. God full of mercy, who dwells in the heights, provide a sure rest upon the divine presence's wings, within the range of the holy, pure, and glorious, who shine and resemble the skies, to the soul of our beloved Steve. The Master of Mercy will protect him forever, and will bind his soul in the bond of everlasting life. God is his inheritance. May you rest in peace. Let us all say, Amen. Finally, my friends, we shall say Kaddish. As you all know, this is the memorial prayer in our tradition, but I would like to remind you that Kaddish is not about death. Kaddish is a hymn of praise to God, and therefore it is a hymn of praise to life itself. And so today, here and now, we shall honor Steve's life. We shall honor his book of life with the sacred words of our ancient prayer. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בהיכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהיה שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעלמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח, ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל. שמי יתגודשה ברכו. לאלה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יש למה רב מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו amen. May God grant peace to those who mourn and comfort all the bereaved among us. Amen. You may be seated, my friends. Jeremy, Mr. Seaver.
Friends, this concludes the services here at the chapel. The family will be together for Shiva at the Continental Restaurant at 788 South Buffalo Grove Road in Buffalo Grove, and they'll be welcoming people there at the Continental as they leave here from the chapel. The family is requesting that when you're there at the Continental with them, to please keep your masks on at all times when you aren't eating or drinking, just to try to provide the safest environment for everyone. The family has also requested that any memorial contributions in his memory to the Lupus Foundation, and that information is available in the service folder that you should have received when you came in. And if you did not receive one as you came in, we do have those for you as you leave. Again, that information regarding memorial contributions is also available on our website for those of you joining us at home. At this time, I would ask everyone to please rise and stand in place as we escort the family and the rabbi from the chapel.
It's exactly what we all need right now. You should be. You should be. Got it. That's right. You will.